Dubrow Suspicion Files.
Hello and welcome. Today, we're looking at a moment that truly shocked the world, the death of John Lennon. But what if the story we've all been told, the story of a crazed fan, isn't the whole story? What if it was something far more sinister? You know, this quote really nails it. The story of Lennon's death really does split into two completely different realities. On one path, you have the tragic official story of a lone deranged fan. But on the other, well, that's where things get much darker, leading to the possibility of a political execution. Let's break down both sides. All right, first, let's walk through the official story. This is the one that's in all the textbooks, the one that legally closed the case. It's the fan theory. And it all comes down to one single disturbed individual. And that individual is, of course, Mark David Chapman. According to the official narrative, this entire tragedy begins and ends with him. His psychological breakdown is presented as the sole motive for the murder. So for a moment, let's try to get inside the mind of the killer. When you look at Chapman's life, it's like watching a downward spiral. It starts with a pretty traumatic childhood, and to cope, he creates this elaborate fantasy world of what he called little people living in his walls. In that world, he was in absolute control. And that deep need for control, it shapeshifted over the years. First into a very rigid religious phase, and then, finally, into a dangerous obsession with a fictional character. And we're not just talking about a casual interest in a book. Chapman didn't just relate to Holden Caulfield, he truly believed he was him. He adopted Caulfield's cynical mission to hunt down and expose the phonies of the adult world. And in Chapman's mind, who was the biggest phony of them all? John Lennon. I mean, from his warped point of view, you have this multimillionaire living in a luxury New York apartment singing "Imagine No Possessions." To Chapman, this was the ultimate hypocrisy, a lie that he felt he had to personally correct. And what's wild is that Chapman himself has basically backed this up. At a parole hearing in 2022, he flat out admitted that his main driver was a desperate, pathological desire for fame. He wanted to steal the spotlight from one of the most famous men on Earth. So there you have it, the official story. It seems neat and tidy, right? But the problem is it leaves this trail of bizarre, unanswered questions. And when you start pulling on those little threads, an entirely different story begins to emerge. And this brings us to that second reality, the hitman theory. In this version of events, Chapman isn't the mastermind. No, he's just the weapon used to silence a major political threat. Now, for this theory to hold any water, Lennon had to be a genuine threat to the establishment. And it turns out, he absolutely was. This is not speculation, this is documented fact. Declassified files show extensive FBI surveillance, a plot by the Nixon administration to deport him, and even CIA involvement under a program called Project Chaos, which was designed to neutralize anti-war figures. And this wasn't some low-level stuff. This memo right here is from Senator Strom Thurmond directly to the White House. He calls deporting Lennon a strategic countermeasure. I mean, you don't use language like that for a pop star. You use it for an enemy combatant. So where does Chapman fit into all this? Well, let's look at his history. While working a minimum wage job, he somehow takes this 6-week trip around the world. Look at this itinerary. It's expensive, extensive, and it includes one stop that is a massive red flag. Beirut in 1978. Now, this was not a tourist destination. It was engulfed in a brutal civil war, a known hub for spies, mercenaries, and assassins. Why on earth would a security guard from Hawaii decide to vacation there? It just makes no sense, unless, of course, it wasn't a vacation. And then there's the money. How does a guy working as a security guard afford $7,500? That's tens of thousands in today's money for a piece of art. It points to some kind of outside funding that just doesn't add up with his paycheck. But honestly, the trip, the money, it might not even be the most jarring piece of the puzzle. The weirdest part might be the man Chapman spent hours talking with right before the shooting, the doorman at the Dakota apartment building, Jose Perdomo. See, Perdomo wasn't just any doorman. He was a Cuban exile and a veteran of a group called Operation 40. This was a notorious CIA-sponsored assassination squad involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. The odds of the man standing next to Lennon's killer happening to be a former CIA-trained assassin, well, they're just staggering. Okay, so with these two completely conflicting realities in mind, let's look at the actual day of the murder and see how the events play out through each of those lenses. The timeline of that night is filled with fateful moments. Around 10:50 p.m., Lennon's limo breaks security protocol, stopping on the street instead of pulling into the secure courtyard. Just 2 minutes later, Chapman drops into what witnesses called a combat stance and fires with deadly accuracy. And then he just waits. He doesn't run. He's found calmly reading his book. Chapman later claimed he heard a voice in his head commanding him, "Do it, do it." So what was it? From the psychiatric viewpoint, it's a classic command hallucination, a symptom of schizophrenia. But from the conspiracy viewpoint, was it a post-hypnotic trigger, a programmed command being activated? And this is where you can see how every key piece of evidence can be interpreted in two completely different ways. Was Jose Perdomo a coincidence, or was he a handler? Was Chapman's calm behavior after the shooting a sign of insanity, or a sign of a programmed deactivation sequence? And here's the crucial part. Because Chapman suddenly pleaded guilty, claiming God told him to, none of these anomalies, the money, the trip to Beirut, the CIA-linked doorman, were ever cross-examined in a public trial. The public never got to hear any of this evidence debated in court. Which really leaves us with this central, unresolved question. We know Chapman was a deeply disturbed man. No one disputes that. But was his illness the root cause of this tragedy? Or was it simply the perfect vulnerability to be exploited, the perfect cover for something else entirely? So what do you take away from all this? The accepted story of a lone fanatic driven by a desire for fame and a literary delusion, or the chilling possibility of a deep state hit on a political dissident? The evidence for both realities exists. The final verdict? Well, that's up to you.